abide the presence of heathens, so there might be peace. And oaths were broken. I forgave. I even lined their pockets, but the Danes will not be sated. Enough! Patience is not thy will. It is the Kingdom of Wessex! And my divine rule.
Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Indy Pride from Milk and Cookies Total War, joined by Oakley from Invicta. What's going on, man?
Hey guys, so yeah, we were going to do a video here discussing Thrones of Britannia. Kind of before this, we decided that we were going to focus on major sections of discussion. So the main ones are going to be faction mechanics, variety in general, sieges, endgame, and optimization. And before we kind of ease into that, I kind of offered to do a little bit of a historical introduction just to set the scene and kind of warm us up, because that's going to inform, obviously, all of those things that we talked about besides maybe optimization. So real quickly, I guess I'll just dive into it. So when we're talking about the British Isles here, this time period, I did want to go back to kind of the Roman influence. So that's going to start, well, at least in terms of legions, in 55 BC, where Julius Caesar comes in, establishes a bit of a foothold, explores Britannia, but it's not until a century later that you have the legions coming in with Claudius, conquering a very big amount of British Isles, and they did so with, I believe it was 4 legions and 4 company auxiliary forces for a total of about 40,000 troops, so pretty substantial in terms of numbers it took to initially conquer it. But then later down the road, with Rome starting to kind of implode and collapse, the legions are forced to pull out of Britannia, which is really interesting, actually, around 410. And as the news of that gets out, it's kind of it's a signal that the area is up for grabs. And so you have, as well as the migration of Germanic tribes into kind of continental Europe, you have them starting to eye the Romano-Briton territories. And so you have the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons coming in and invading, raiding, but also seeking territory to establish themselves. It's during this time period where we start to lose more and more of the actual history and records, so it becomes very shady, and that's where you have sort of the Arthurian legends rising up. And it's believed King Arthur was one of those Romano-Briton warlords who was trying to hold back the new invaders. For the most part, they didn't fare so well against these new invaders, although I think notably at the I can't remember if it's an actual battle or a legendary battle, but the Battle of Mountbatten, where King Arthur is supposed to have been present. This is one of the main ones where the Romano-British are able to beat back the invaders, at least in this battle, but they can't hold back the tide. So eventually you do have these new settlers who come in, a new kind of mixing happening and a new ruling class. So in this new period, you have different kingdoms that become established. They vie for control of the territory. And you have these pretty big changes that start to happen over time as Rome's influence dwindles. So a couple main things that I did want to point out to happen during this time period that show to the kind of the differences that we're talking about. One is kind of going to be the decline of coinage during this period. You start to see it going away. They refer to a lot of bartering, a lot of the Roman systems where they had a lot of big commercial centers. A lot of the public works start to be abandoned. We have evidence of actual like people living inside of the bathhouses, things like that, them no longer being maintained. So coinage, trade goes down, manufacturing goes down, people start to depopulate from the population centers, they kind of go elsewhere. Other indications of what's going on, literacy starts to go down and decrease. The religion, earlier there had been Christian influences. This starts to recede as well, to the point where later on Christianity has to be reintroduced. Literacy rates go down. So you have all kinds of stuff happening here where it's kind of reverting to not only localized power, but a lot of the hallmarks of Roman influence starts to kind of diminish. And then you have these kingdoms that vie, and these are the ones that going into this Thrones of Britannia we start to become familiar with, the kingdoms of Northumbria, Wessex, Mercia, and things like that. So as these kingdoms kind of start to vie, different ones start to get a bit of an edge over one another. They're all relatively powerful, but it's at this point that you start to get the Viking invasions in the 8th century coming in, and they start to hit various places in Europe. They contribute to the collapse or the decline of the Franks, but they never really settle there, whereas in the British Isles, this is one of the main places that they do settle en masse, and their rapid assault is much more, it accelerates much more quickly than you had seen in the Frankish kingdoms and elsewhere, and they hit pretty hard, and you start to see them overrun kind of the eastern parts. And this is where the game kind of sets us with the invasions. Alfred the Great does manage to hold out in Wessex, and just when the game starts, he has won, I believe, the Battle of Edington, and establishes a treaty with the new invaders, where they are then going to have the eastern side of the Danelaw. Wessex stays to the west. So that's kind of where we are here. The time period that's going to happen after this is essentially going to be Alfred the Great does reforms to improve the power of Wessex. Then there's going to be a protracted stage where Wessex tries to get more and more influence over Britannia and does a gradual reconquest of the Danelaw, to the point where Wessex does have kind of control over this area. You have the heirs of Alfred the Great, who's there. But then kind of down the road, what ends up happening is you have more invaders coming in. So even though Wessex is kind of key, there's going to be more Viking invasions that come around the beginning of the 11th century, once both Norway and Denmark are going to be united by the Danish king Knut. And he comes in, and this is going to be, potentially we'll talk about this later, a late game event where you kind of have Scandinavia being united. Then this is a big Viking force that comes back, reinvades, and they do kind of take over Wessex, I believe. King Knut rules for about 20 years. He dies, and then you have the return of an Anglo-Saxon king, King Edward the Confessor. But then what happens after that is once he dies, then you have a power vacuum. Who's going to claim the throne? And that's where you have Harold Godwinson. He's actually the Earl of Wessex, so he's kind of the native ruler who's claiming this throne. But then you also have other people who are going to vie for the throne and contend for that throne. So you're going to have Harald Hardrada, who's going to be the Norwegian king, who's threatening to invade, and who actually does try and invade in the late summer of 1066. But then also to the south, you have William the Bastard from Normandy, who's going to try and claim the throne as well. So now you have a triple vying for the throne there. And that's what CA has said is likely to be kind of the logical end date for this game. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of possible end game, but that seems to be where they're going to be cutting it off. So with that being said, I think we've done a good coverage of the history itself, and now we'll leap into discussing the various sections of this. So faction mechanics, variety, sieges, endgame, and optimization. So yeah, that's it. And now we'll get back and rejoin Indie Pride.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious actually if the Battle of Hastings will actually be the last point of the game. I think that'd be a pretty cool logical stopping point and give you kind of that historical battle to really conclude the campaign. It'd be pretty sweet. It's kind of a long, honestly, I didn't expect Thrones of Britannia to be quite as long as the game is actually set for. I mean, you're starting in, it sounds like 878 going all the way to 1066. That's a longer period of time than I would have expected. But yeah, so we're going to jump in here and talk about faction mechanics and how they could actually translate to some of the factions. Now, I do want to point out, and this might trigger people, but hear me out for a second. I think Warhammer actually has done a really fantastic job in differentiating the factions between each other. I think one of the things that makes Warhammer stand out is not just the unit variety, but the faction variety and how CA has gone in and kind of changed what it means to be the differences between factions. And I think that Thrones of Britannia could learn a lot from Warhammer in that aspect. I think that in terms of variety in general, Thrones of Britannia will be much less, obviously, because you're in a very geographical, kind of tied off from the rest of Europe. A lot of factions that are going to be very similar to each other. So one of the best ways to differentiate them is, of course, with unique mechanics that make them play differently. Even though on the battlefield, the unit variety may not quite be certainly as similar to something like Warhammer, where you've got a bunch of different variety going on, certainly have the potential on the campaign map itself to differentiate them. So I think a lot of this campaign in general is going to revolve around Alfred the Great, who was known as this great reformer, very intelligent king who basically fostered communication throughout the regions that he controlled. He spread knowledge, he spread legal reforms, he reorganized the fjord system, and helped build up the navy. And which on paper, that navy part sounds kind of hilarious, because I think historical documents maybe mention something like 12 longships that he built under his care, so it's not like a gigantic navy we're talking about, but he helped foster a lot of the things that would kind of push England and that whole area into a very powerful kingdom a little bit later on. Not that it wasn't then, but certainly grew in power as we moved towards the colonial period and all of that. But he stressed the importance of education and technology. Those were things that he really thought were incredibly important, and this was fostered mostly around religious sites like abbeys and churches. And like I said, he had a pretty big impact on British history heading into this new era. So I think certainly in terms of mechanics, there's a lot to talk about here. There's the fjord system, which Oakley can cover. There's the connection to the Danes and their homeland and how their technology tree and how reinforcements will be handled in the game. Like, how will they receive reinforcements? Will armies come in waves? Will it kind of be like Attila in that manner in terms of Viking invasions, secondary ones coming in the late game? Or when you play as a Danish faction, are you going to be getting reinforcements from off screen? We know that on the map itself, only the British Isles themselves are going to be playable. There's not going to be any of Norway or any other part of Europe. It's actually a part of the campaign map. So these are things that are very much worth talking about. So Oakley, do you want to jump in right now, talk about the fjord system a little bit and how Alfred the Great reorganized that and helped foster the defense of his homeland in general?
Yeah, sure. I do want to say right now I'm kind of on taking a look at the map that they announced, and when we're looking at the British Isles, it's going to be more than just Alfred the Great. I'm seeing now that they have Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Northern England, Southern England. Within that, there's like the Danelaw. So there's a bunch of different campaign mechanics. I don't think we know too much, at least myself and Indie Pride, about the different minor ones to speculate. But I think the main ones you're right that we should talk about is first Alfred the Great, kind of defining what's going to be happening with Wessex and his kind of faction mechanics. And then the other ones I kind of propose talking about is like factions of the Danelaw, what they're going to be able to do. So let's start primarily with Alfred the Great. So as Indy was alluding to, some of the things we'll probably see is he's going to be able to go up in terms of like mechanics for the military. So hopefully he has a specific upgrade system for cities and settlements to make them more resilient to sieges. So either making them have more garrison forces, maybe some cheaper upkeep for them, or also the ability to hold out longer in terms of sieges and repulse invasions, something along those military reforms that he did. Same thing goes with revitalizing technology and maybe literacy or even culture. He'll have benefits, I would presume, owing to the fact that he was one of the few kings in recent history for this time period, and even for the last couple, the next couple successors, he was one of the few who was able to actually not only read and write, but actually produce knowledgeable books and treaties and things like that. So he also is known to have drawn to his court a lot of intellectuals and things of that nature. So I think we're going to be seeing both military reforms and cultural reforms and improvements being like key to him. And then if you look on the other side of things at kind of the Danish influence ones, what I was speculating that we might see in terms of them would be some way to represent their off-screen ties to Norway and Denmark. Because obviously they're not only going to have cultural ties to those guys, but direct familial ties to some of the leaders back there. The Viking raids themselves were often times where you would go out, raid, and then come back. Yes, the people in the Danelaw did come to settle, but there are still people coming and going to raid continuously. Different parts, not only the eastern side of the British Isles, but the western side. So I think that for the Danish factions here, in terms of their like unique faction mechanics, they're going to have some way to interact with the people back home. Kind of like we saw in Caesar in Gaul, where your technology advancement was like you playing politics back at Rome, and you could call in favors, armies might arrive. So that's kind of what I'm pushing for unique faction mechanics. Another thing I assume we're going to see for the Saxons as well is going to be something to do with their way they navigate Britain or the British Isles. So I think they're going to have a way to move more quickly using river routes. That is one of the ways that the Vikings got about, penetrated almost everywhere, not only in the British Isles, but also on the continent, that they were known for traveling across rivers. So I presume you'll be able to kind of tech that up, because early on, I'm guessing maybe they'll tie this to some sort of like advanced maps. So at first you start off with the ability to go up certain rivers, and then if you research like advanced maps or something, you can go deeper into rivers. And then there was also in the Frankish kingdoms, the Carolingians knew that the Vikings were going up rivers, and they tried to block them with these like fortified bridges or put chains across, and the Vikings would just lift their boats, walk around, and come back. So maybe that's another thing also, like another tier of technology for the Danes here will be the ability to like lift your ships, and maybe that might be owed to something like new ship construction, lightweight, or something like that. So that's something that I see them maybe doing.
Well, and it's not just from a technology tree perspective there, right? I mean, that could be
experience,
a new kind of, well, yeah, and it could be a new kind of battle as well. I mean, I don't believe we've ever had a Total War game where we had river combat, and that's actually something we're going to be talking about in a Three Kingdoms video that we do very similar to this one as well. In the river combat and, well, naval combat in general, we're going to be seeing the return of that and how big an impact that will play. I mean, obviously for the Danish kingdoms, they were very well known for their Viking raids, their lightning-fast raids with their longships. Alfred the Great built some very big ones with 60 oars. They were pretty gigantic ships. Naval combat will play a big role there. I also did want to make a quick segue before you continue. That fjord system is literally perfect for something that we already have in a Total War game already, and that is the Bretonian peasant system. If you basically pull peasants from the fields, you're not going to be able to create or make all the food that you wanted to. So there's going to probably, in the fjord system, be a limit to how much you can actually pull to the front lines without getting those public order penalties or those food penalties. That'll actually be a very important thing, because you're basically, the fjord system is pulling these basically peasants or people who work the land up to the front lines, and like that's all fine and good, except no one at home is now making that food. So the Bretonian system, the way that works in the Bretonian campaign Total War Warhammer, would actually fit this system almost to a T, and I think that could definitely be something that would be pretty easy for CA to copy and paste over, and certainly give you a lot of flavor in terms of a faction mechanic there, because people liked it. Well, I can't say that everybody loved it in Warhammer, but it certainly made Bretonia feel unique compared to some other factions.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in terms of faction mechanics, I think we've pointed out that mechanic that you mentioned could be kind of universal to a lot of the kingdoms. But in terms of the faction mechanics that we fleshed out, kind of Alfred the Great-esque stuff influencing Wessex and maybe the other similar cultural groups and factions, and then the ones I talked about the Danes. There's also other factions in the game around Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. I don't know enough historically to talk too much about that. I just know that Ireland, in terms of the monasteries and stuff, were great sources of, they did store wealth, but also intellectual centers, so there may be a dynamic around that. But besides that, I don't quite know enough about those to speculate too much about like what would be their standout faction mechanics. Perhaps it could be something tied to like a revival of the old ways, because in these kind of remote areas, you still have the Celts. So people who weren't invaded by the Anglo-Saxons or the Danes, you have kind of the original Celts. So maybe they'll have something about kind of these ancestral ways that you can push to differentiate them. So that's kind of interesting.
Thrones of Britannia is basically going to be very focused on the history. We already know that. Everything we've heard about the game sounds like it's basically going to be pure history. Yes, as the same with every other Total War game in history, there are probably going to be a few fantasy elements, things that aren't quite exactly historically accurate. But comparing Rise of the Three Kingdoms, which we'll be talking about soon, to Thrones of Britannia, it sounds like Thrones of Britannia is 100% going to be that pure historical gameplay. Now, the question is, and I think it's definitely worth discussing, is how hard or easy is it going to be to transfer or shift from a Warhammer game that has very known for its variety, the fact that you have these really unique factions, these really unique unit mechanics and units in general, and then shifting to something like Thrones of Britannia, where there's a lot of very similar kingdoms all vying for control. And it's something that Oakley and I have talked a lot about recently, is how is variety going to make an impact on Thrones of Britannia gameplay? Because you're essentially going to, and I don't want to oversimplify it, because this is a very interesting and unique period of history, no question about that. But in terms of actual units, I think that might be a problem for the game. If we're talking about mailed guy with sword and shield, mailed guy with sword, mailed guy with two-handed axe, mailed guy with whatever weapon combo you want to think of, he's got a say axe or whatever kind of weapon, there's certainly, and especially we're talking about a time period where knights really aren't making a big impact on the field. They've already confirmed that heavy knights, heavy cavalry aren't really going to be a thing. Wales, I believe, is going to have the highest tier cavalry in the game, and it's basically just going to be guys with decent equipment, sword and shield to mail, but nothing like really incredibly unique or interesting about them when you compare them to like Blood Knights or something like that. Certainly from a visual perspective, going to be a little bit less impactful there. So how will that play out in terms of the variety? Will there be enough in terms of battlefield mechanics to really differentiate it? And I think that's where CA really needs to step their game up, right? To make up for that. I don't even think it's a perceived lack of variety. I think it's very clear that there will be less of it than something like Warhammer. They need to make sure that the actual mechanics in place on the campaign map, in terms of siege battles, in terms of the new unique stuff that they're adding. So we're maybe talking about those river crossing battles, the shift between naval combat and land combat, combining that into a single really interesting looking battlefield. All of that is going to be really important. Creative Assembly is really going to have to nail that element, all those elements, or I don't know that the game's actually going to do incredibly well, because one, it's a very focused period of history. Certainly a lot of British fans and a lot of people from America I know are into that kind of history, but there's also plenty of markets, just like with Warhammer and any other Total War game he has ever made, that aren't going to be in love with that time period. So they have a lot to balance here, I think, and this is a opportunity for CA to really up the ante on siege mechanics, make them way better than they were in Warhammer, because as we know, the vanilla siege battles in Warhammer are not impressive by any means, and basically add a lot of that polish and gameplay from stuff like Medieval 2 that we really loved and really enjoyed. I think CA is going to have to nail that, or the game might not do that well. What did you think about that, Oakley?
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. So in terms of general variety, I think you're going to have to nail it in the campaign, and it's going to have to be carrying the team or carrying the title, because I don't think we'll expect too much from variety on the battlefield itself. So that's kind of what we're expecting of them. On the battlefield, I think there is still hope that they can make it bring some variety. The way I see them potentially being able to do it is, okay, first you start off with everyone having roughly similar looking type units. But I hope that they start to implement some unique aspects of it. So for instance, if you look at Warhammer 2, the way Skaven play, where there's kind of like different tiers. So at some point Skaven is strong while in numbers, but then at the end they'll flee more quickly. Maybe they could start to do that for different factions, to have them hit different tiers in the battle. I know that's kind of getting more fantasy, but I think they could still implement something that's a bit historical. So that would be one thing, different kind of like in battle faction mechanics. Another one that I could see that could differentiate it as well would be pushing more on unit formations and abilities, making that stronger. So having obviously different types of shield walls would be great. Different formations that you can adopt to break shield walls, different wedges, which faction is and is not able to form those, and make it more rock, paper, scissors in terms of like the formations that you can put. So that would be another thing. And then lastly would be the different types of units. Like Indy said, I mean, you're going to have probably light raiders, which have like axes or something. Then you'll have, swords, spears, and then you'll have your like heavy elite troops. And then maybe you'll have some cavalry. I think what we'll be seeing is maybe some hybrid roles within there. So I know at some point the Vikings were known to be able to have like multiple roles, to be able to pull out a bow, fire it, and then drop it and charge into melee. So maybe you'll be seeing a couple hybrid units playing kind of like the Lothar Sea Guard, in the sense that they're archers, but they can still defend themselves. So maybe you'll be seeing, if everyone has kind of the same general tools, they'll have a couple little unique units like that have hybrid roles or special roles that'll make them stick out. So that's how I could see them kind of make things interesting in terms of variety.
Yeah, and it's not that there's not going to be any unit variety in the game. There certainly will be. We're going to be getting Berserkers, we're going to be getting Thanes and House Girls, and we're going to be getting a little bit of Heavy Cav, not a lot, not actual Knights or anything quite on that aspect quite yet. But certainly there will be some there. I think that one of the best ways CA could use to differentiate these factions when you're looking about it on a actual battlefield perspective is color. And I think that was one thing that Attila lacked very heavily. And that was something that was intentional, right? When you look at the art direction and design for Attila, it was supposed to be this cataclysmic Armageddon where the northern border of the map basically just gets more frigid and cold, and everything starts looking dreary and drab, and your fertility, all the regions up there are just dying. Everything's getting burnt to the ground, and it's fire and death and blood everywhere. Attila is coming to burn the world. So from that gameplay, from that game in general, it makes sense what they did. They wanted to make it drab and kind of like Armageddon, the way it would if the world was on fire and everyone was dying. So I understand that. But in Thrones of Britannia, I think a great way to differentiate the factions will be color. And there are multiple ways to do this. So the artistic direction is very important. And I think the map design in general is very important. The way you design the settlements, the way you design the actual landscape, the way you put color into it. So there's going to be there should be a lot of bright greens, a lot of bright blues, a lot of things that really make the color of the battlefield pop out at you. This isn't something that Attila really had because everything looks so bland and brown, but the unit colors themselves, really important as well. If you look at low-level Saxon troops in Attila, and then look at low-level Norwegian troops, and then look at low-level... I mean, even if you go all the way out to where the Eastern Roman Empire is, a lot of the units looking very similar there, a lot of browns, a lot of dark reds, nothing that really pops out at you until you get all the way into the eastern regions of the empire, when you're talking about the Sassanids and that kind of stuff. So I felt like that was something that kind of made Attila feel samey. Certainly there was the something Germanic that became a meme. There's so many factions that played very similarly, had almost the exact same roster from top to bottom. But certainly there's going to be some similarities with that in Thrones of Britannia. But if you add a lot of color, if you make that pop, I think it will leave a much better impression on people. Not just that, though. I think one of the big things is the banner system. And this is, again, something that me and Oakley have talked about before. And I've mentioned it before in videos. I really despise the banner system in Attila. I think it made every faction, when you're zoomed out, look the exact same. Literally, if I took my mom or my sister or anyone in my family and brought them into my computer room and had them look at a battlefield, and they see the red and yellow icons over every faction, and then I send them out and then change the screen and put 2 new factions on the screen and bring them back in, they would not be able to tell a difference. Because when you're zoomed out, you're looking at ants, basically. The way that you differentiate factions when you're zoomed out and playing, which is when most of us are playing a Total War game, right? We're microing our troops, all that. The way you differentiate it is by putting unique and colorful faction banners in that adds that flavor and that variety into the game. And that was something that Attila completely lacked. Because you couldn't tell, hey, I'm playing Assassinid Empire right now. You couldn't tell, hey, I'm playing Saxons right now. It looks the same. You have that yellow icon over the top. You have that red icon for your enemy. You have the blues for your allies. So when they go back, and I really hope that CA does this, it sounds like such a tiny thing, but replayability is really important. And when I feel like I'm playing the same faction every single time I jump into the game, that's not a good thing. So something as simple as adding a unique banner over the top of every faction that says, hey, I'm playing this faction, like Warhammer has it, like Shogun 2 has it, like every other Total War game in history besides Attila has it. You've got to have that color variety that, 1, makes the game pop, 2, makes it so you can easily and quickly differentiate between factions. I think that's going to be really important as well.
Okay, did you want to talk a bit more specifically about sieges?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can just kind of sit down and have a little bit of a discussion about sieges in general. So, for siege battles in general, what do you want to see return? Like, obviously, we've had discussions about this before. We're not incredibly enthused with how sieges were handled in Total War Warhammer, the vanilla ones. Thankfully, we got the modding tools that allowed for much more unique and elaborate and fun layouts, even though the AI couldn't necessarily always handle them particularly well. Certainly, there's a lot of replayability and a lot of different features and functions that were added from the modding teams that made a lot of those sieges a lot more fun for multiplayer. So when you go into Thrones of Britannia here, what are you going to be looking for specifically in sieges that will make them more fun, more replayable, all that kind of stuff?
Well, we'll start with what's confirmed so far. So this is going back to the way sieges were done in Rome 2 and Attila, which means that the city is generally in the center and you can attack from all directions. So we pretty much know that that's back. The other thing that they kind of confirmed is the fact that in Attila, there is a couple of things. One, there's siege escalation. Two, when you have the sieges, there's the option to have not only siege equipment like towers, but also artillery pieces and stuff. And then the city could burn down and progress over time. So there's like a bunch of different things in there. In the sieges here, yeah, they've confirmed that we still can attack from all directions, but they say siege towers are pretty much gone and artillery pieces are few and far between, which is historically accurate. But what that means is kind of coming into this confirmed, we have a lot of the ways in which you attack a city stripped away. And so I hope that CA doesn't just stick with what's left. I hope they introduce new mechanics. So I hope they, for instance, revisit the way you attack a gate instead of just running up to it and throwing torches. I hope they find a different way to address that, different ways to maybe escalate walls, maybe, I don't know, not the Shogun way of kind of clambering up it or throwing grappling hooks, but I hope they find a new way to like assault walls or perhaps do different ways to storm it. Not pocket ladders like we saw in Warhammer 2, or the bulky ones, or sorry, not the pocket ladders in Warhammer 1 and 2, or the big lumbering ladders we saw in Rome 2. I don't know. I think they need to add more if they're going to be stripping stuff away. Another thing that's not quite confirmed, actually, is like the barricades also that we had in Attila and deployables from Rome 2. I always really like that in sieges. I hope they do bring it
balls.
back. Yeah, flaming balls would be a huge necessity. So I really hope they bring that type of stuff. Other things that they might do for sieges, I don't know what they could possibly do besides maybe introducing, just like I said, more methods for attack and more methods for defense. And more interesting layouts, I guess, which they've already stated they're going to be pushing for.
Yeah, so they said that the major, I don't think you said this, they said the major settlements will be represented by 16 different battle maps. None will be unique to any single point on the campaign map, and there won't be any unique capital cities either, so they're not going to create, like for Attila or Rome 2, where there's a unique Ravenna and a unique Rome and a unique Caledonia, whatever the capital city of that era or that place is. There's not going to be any unique settlements. It's going to be 16 different ones. They're going to be spread throughout the map. They're all going to have their own unique layouts. But they are based on real-life locations, and you will see different map types, say, in Ireland versus Northern Britain. And then they also said they're aiming for variety. You'll see hill forts, you'll see Saxon river towns, older settlements with Roman walls, and so on. But there won't be any Motte and Baileys or hardcore castles yet, because that's a little bit later on when those big castles with the big sets of walls start getting put in. And I think they also said that only the capital cities will have walls. Oakley said that. I'd have to go back and actually 100% make sure that that's true, because the way they're saying it, if the capital cities were the only ones that had walls, that would mean that they were technically unique layouts. So we'll figure that out. But regardless, I think that most of us can agree that the way that Warhammer handled vanilla sieges was not as good. It was way too streamlined, way too... I mean, I hate using the word arcadey because...
I mean, it's just dumbed down.
Yeah, it is dumbed down. And dumbed down battles, like, I feel like people use that sometimes way too... Stripping mechanics out isn't necessarily a bad thing. It depends which ones and how you handle it. But I think most of us can agree that sieges in Warhammer were weak and that they can be massively improved in this game. And I think that, again, if CA wants to get over the fact that the variety will be lessened in a game like this, they need to nail the other aspects of the game, and sieges are going to be a huge selling point, for sure, both from a multiplayer and a single-player perspective. They need to make sure that those sieges are fun, they're replayable, they're unique, and they can't just be a rehash of what was in Attila and Rome 2, even though we did like those, certainly. I mean, we've had some amazing ones over the years. We did Rome Settlement Siege, we've done a lot of Constantinople, done some great ones, and certainly Attila and Rome 2 more lend themselves to that kind of amazing multiplayer siege element. But you can't just rehash what's already been in previous Total Wars. Like, you need to evolve, and they need to improve the core gameplay that's been there before. And so I think that's a pretty important point there. The rough thing is that I'm not actually incredibly well-versed on how sieges were handled during this time period, but I don't think that it was an incredibly unique aspect of siege warfare, or an incredibly unique period of history in siege warfare. So CA might need to think outside the box a little bit to make things basically freshen stuff up, make it a little bit more lively and fun. We'll see how they decide to handle that. Do you want to talk about the late game a little bit here? How they might handle the late game?
Yeah, let's transition to the late game. So kind of two main points that I want to talk about the late game is one, late game events, and then the other one is what is like the overarching thing you're pressing towards, in the sense like what is the equivalent Eye of the Vortex type mechanic that you're pushing towards. So let's talk about kind of late game events. So those are probably going to be tied to history. They're going to be renewed Viking invasions, I would assume. Big waves coming in, like Knut coming in would be a big one. And then the very, very late game towards 1066 is going to be when you have William, the Bastard of Normandy, coming in and invading, as well as Harold Hardrada coming in and invading as well. So that would be the super lame game. So I would expect over time you have maybe minor Viking culminate raids, and then bigger ones over time to kind of hit you. And then eventually late game, kind of some big ones. And then as Indie Pride said, maybe a final battle where whoever currently has the throne of Britannia has to fight the Battle of Hastings, something like that.
Yeah.
Or both battles, against both invaders.
And I want to segue there real quick, because I think one of the cool things that they could take from previous games is I would really like to see historical battles in campaign, which I don't believe they've ever done that before. And basically take Warhammer quest battles, but obviously in a history aspect, and put it into your campaign. So say it reaches a certain date, you get on your campaign map a battlefield. You can't fast teleport, none of those shenanigans in there, but essentially a cross swords icon on your campaign map where you march to that point on the map and do a historical battle in the same way a Warhammer quest battle happens. You get that kind of story element into your campaign, and it'd be a great way to basically liven up the campaign and kind of put some of that personal flair and touch on those main characters, like Alfred the Great. Some of those characters that you really want to see become a little bit more larger than life, a little bit more in your face and there and real. It'd be a great way to get those battle speeches that we love from Medieval 2 back in the game again. It'd be just a great way to learn about history in general. So I think that would be a fantastic way to include more gameplay elements into the campaign and really make you feel like you're a part of that history. When you go to something like the Battle of Edington and you're leading Alfred the Great, obviously this game happens right after that, but something like that where Alfred the Great's leading a charge in, he does a rousing speech, and then the layout of the armies, the way the reinforcements come in, are kind of inspired by a real historical battle. I think that'd be a fantastic touch to the game as well.
Yeah, that's actually a huge point that I hadn't thought about, and I really want to start raising that to CA. I'm actually going to try and make a point to bring that up to them in person, because I would love to see that. This has so much potential, because one of the main things that I have issues with is kind of like the late game. Something happens on the campaign map, but then the player can cheese that army or do whatever to manipulate the AI both on the campaign map, and then when you finally fight that battle, it's the same AI deployment and AI thinking, and you can still cheese it in there. So that's kind of the trouble with that. Whereas here, if you transition the encounter with the late game armies to be something that's like a historical battle, CA can put that a lot more in a much more structured environment where the AI behaves in much more within a certain like guideline, and it can be a lot harder to trick, as well as having a lot more maybe dynamic events in the battle, reinforcements streaming in from specific sides or different things triggering. So that's a really huge point that is super underdeveloped right now and has a lot of potential. So that's actually a really good point.
Yeah, what I don't want to have happen, and this is going to be obviously pushing it to the maximum, and I don't think this would actually happen, but say there's some kind of Battle of Hastings that's supposed to happen at the end of your campaign, but it's supposed to happen organically, and CA kind of builds it so that's supposed to happen organically rather than in a structured environment. What could happen is, Harold Godwinson decides to bring a bunch of levy freemen equivalents to the battlefield, and then your late game battle is basically against a bunch of peasants who mass rout, and it's a complete joke. Or they got murdered on the way to marching to that last battle, and it's like you don't even get to play it, that kind of thing. Like, obviously that wouldn't actually happen, but you don't want a situation where the premier late game event that's supposed to be exciting and interesting and unique gets cheesed out. Like, you could cheese the crap out of Mongol hordes in Medieval 2, or some of the other Total War history games. You don't want that to happen. I think that the quest battle, the historical battle element would really make it less cheesy, and it would make it a much more fitting conclusion to the end of your campaign, which some of the historical games really haven't had a fantastic end game, so might be a great way to freshen that up a bit.
Yeah, cool. So that was one of the points of the end game things that we want to talk about is like events. So that's one of them. The other talk about the end game is like, what is the overall thing that you're trying to do? Like the Eye of the Vortex. What's the what's the narrative that you're pursuing? So what they've put out in all the trailers is like Game of Thrones, Thrones of Britannia. They're trying to make that similarity. So there's going to be some mechanic that's driving you to get control of all of Britannia. So the question that I would pose is, what is the mechanic that's behind that? So if we look maybe at like Rome 2, the stuff that they've been doing, it's like internal politics to get control of like balance of the Senate or whatever in terms of your like specific family. So for here, is it going to be like control of the local council, or is it going to be based on territory that you have, or do you have to maybe form coalitions, kind of like in Warhammer? Like if you're in the north and you're Norska, do you go around and kind of beat up your local tribes and force them to follow you? Is that how you kind of claim the throne here? So I'm very curious. Or is it popular sentiment? Do you have to be a very popular leader? Do you have to win a certain number of battles against the Vikings to show that you are the true defender? I'm very curious about kind of what are the check boxes in this progression to being, you know, the guy on the throne here.
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting point of discussion in general. It's like how do they make a end game that one can't be cheesed, which again, lots of end games from Warhammer to all the way back to Medieval 2 and such, you can kind of abuse them pretty hard, but make it challenging, unique, and something to look forward to, because something that's very common in strategy games in general, the end game is a slog. Like when you get to that point, you're 150, 200 turns into a campaign, a lot of people just don't want to play anymore because it's not that fun. You're just kind of going through the motions at that point, trying to auto-resolve your battles. You've seen everything the faction has to offer. How does CA revolutionize the late game to make people want to actually play it? That's a big point of discussion that CA needs to address, that I feel like they haven't really addressed in a lot of their games before. Like, how do we get people to actually care and want to play without just ending the game? I think that's something that CA needs to do for sure.
Cool. I think the last section we had was optimization. Do you want to touch on that before we kind of call it?
I mean, I think everybody knows Attila, which is what this game is based on. It's going to have a similar engine. We don't know exactly what that means yet. Important point to note that when they say that a game's on the same engine, like, these engines are so heavily modular and modifiable now that it doesn't necessarily... People keep saying new engine, new engine. Like, we already know that Warhammer 2 is incredibly different in terms of battlefield mechanics and the engine than something like Shogun 2. Like, there's a world of difference between those two games in terms of battlefield. So just saying change the engine doesn't really mean anything because they are heavily modified, and it's kind of hard to know, like, how far CA needs to go with that. But I feel like there's a huge gap, a gulf between previous historical games and Warhammer. But optimization in Attila, rather, it was awful. Like, I think the vast majority of us can agree. Yes, there are those edge cases. I've seen people say that Attila runs perfectly fine for them. But the consensus on Total War forums and on Total War Reddit, and there have been many posts about it, is that Attila runs like a dog turd lit on fire and placed on top of your processor. It's like you zoom in and you go from like 60 FPS to 15 or 20. It sometimes becomes a slideshow. It doesn't handle a lot of troops very well. It's a gorgeous looking game. It just, one, has the color problem, which I addressed earlier, but has the frames per second problem. And when I play a Total War game, when I zoom in, if I see my FPS just go to dog crap, I lose a lot of interest in playing it. So I really think CA needs to, and they've said they would, hopefully they do, address that optimization part heavily. Want it to be a good looking game, obviously, but I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit on the visual side if you can get it running smoothly. So when I zoom in, not dropping below 45 FPS, that kind of thing. Like, I've got a really good computer, and when I zoom in and I'm dropping those frames, that's not fun. So hopefully something that CA addresses for sure.
Cool. Yeah, I would mirror your complaints and concerns. And then hopefully if they do update things like they're saying, maybe retroactively put those into Attila. So we'll see.
Yeah, I don't know if that's going to happen, but I really hope it does, because that's one of the biggest things that prevents me from playing that game and why I'm not excited for really great mods like Rise of Mordor and some of the other ones, is that the game just runs terribly. Every time I try to do a replay for it, I can just like feel my computer slowing to a crawl, and it's not a good thing. So yeah, I mean, I think we pretty much covered everything we wanted to on Thrones of Britannia. Let me know what you guys think about the game and what will get you to buy it, what will get you excited for it. I am looking forward to playing it. I want to try it out. I want to see how the multiplayer is. I want to see how the sieges are. I want to see how the campaign is and go from there. I think that CA can learn a lot from the games they've made recently to help differentiate those factions, make them more unique, and basically make it more replayable, which is what we want at the end of the day. We want a replayable Total War where we're encouraged to go in and play multiple campaigns and get a very different, unique experience. And hopefully Thrones of Britannia can deliver. Hopefully CA can deliver on that front. We shall see. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. That's all I got to say. You got anything else you want to say?
Nope. See ya.
All right. We'll see you later. Have a good one, guys.